Ernest Hemingway, born July 21, 1899, Cicero, now in Oak Park, Illinois, U.S., died July 2, 1961, Ketchum, Idaho, was an American novelist and short story writer, awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954. He was noted both for the intense masculinity of his writing and for his adventurous and widely publicized life. His succinct and lucid prose style exerted a powerful influence on American and British fiction in the 20th century. The first son of Clarence Edmonds Hemingway, a doctor, and Grace Hall Hemingway, Ernest Miller Hemingway was born in a suburb of Chicago. He was educated in the public schools and began to write in high school, where he was active and outstanding, but the parts of his boyhood that mattered most were summers spent with his family on Walloon Lake in Upper Michigan. On graduation from high school in 1917, impatient for a less sheltered environment, he did not enter college but went to Kansas City, where he was employed as a reporter for the Star. He was repeatedly rejected for military service because of a defective eye, but he managed to enter World War I as an ambulance driver for the American Red Cross. On July 8, 1918, not yet 19 years old, he was injured on the Austro-Italian front at Fosse Alta di Piave. Decorated for heroism and hospitalized in Milan, he fell in love with a Red Cross nurse, Agnes von Kurowski, who declined to marry him. These were experiences he was never to forget. After recuperating at home, Hemingway renewed his efforts at writing, for a while worked at odd jobs in Chicago, and sailed for France as a foreign correspondent for the Toronto Star. Advised and encouraged by other American writers in Paris, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, Ezra Pound, he began to see his non-journalistic work appear in print there, and in 1925 his first important book, a collection of stories called In Our Time, was published in New York City. It was originally released in Paris in 1924. In 1926 he published The Sun Also Rises, a novel with which he scored his first solid success. A pessimistic but sparkling book, it deals with a group of aimless expatriates in France and Spain, members of the post-war lost generation, a phrase that Hemingway scorned while making it famous. This work also introduced him to the limelight, which he both craved and resented for the rest of his life. Hemingway's The Torrents of Spring, a parody of the American writer Sherwood Anderson's book Dark Laughter, also appeared in 1926. At least in the public view, however, the novel A Farewell to Arms, 1929, overshadowed such works. Reaching back to his experience as a young soldier in Italy, Hemingway developed a grim but lyrical novel of great power, fusing love story with war story. While serving with the Italian ambulance service during World War I, the American Lieutenant Frederick Henry falls in love with the English nurse Catherine Barclay, who tends him during his recuperation after being wounded. She becomes pregnant by him, but he must return to his post. Henry deserts during the Italians' disastrous retreat after the Battle of Caporetto, and the reunited couple flee Italy by crossing the border into Switzerland. There, however, Catherine and her baby die during childbirth, and Henry is left desolate at the loss of the great love of his life. Hemingway's love of Spain and his passion for bullfighting resulted in Death in the Afternoon, 1932, a learned study of a spectacle he saw more as tragic ceremony than as sport. Similarly, a safari he took in 1933-34 in the big game region of Tanganyika resulted in Green Hills of Africa, 1935, an account of big game hunting. Mostly for the fishing, he purchased a house in Key West, Florida, and bought his own fishing boat. A minor novel of 1937 called To Have and Have Not is about a Caribbean desperado and is set against a background of lower-class violence and upper-class decadence in Key West during the Great Depression. By now Spain was in the midst of civil war. Still deeply attached to that country, Hemingway made 4 trips there, once more a correspondent. He raised money for the Republicans in their struggle against the Nationalists under General Francisco Franco, and he wrote a play called The Fifth Column, 1938, which is set in besieged Madrid. As in many of his books, the protagonist of the play is based on the author. Following his last visit to the Spanish War, he purchased Finca Vigia, Lookout Farm, an unpretentious estate outside Havana, Cuba, and went to cover another war, the Japanese invasion of China. The harvest of Hemingway's considerable experience of Spain in War and Peace was the novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, 1940, a substantial and impressive work that some critics consider his finest novel, in preference to A Farewell to Arms. It was also the most successful of all his books as measured in sales. Set during the Spanish Civil War, it tells of Robert Jordan, an American volunteer who was sent to join a guerrilla band behind the nationalist lines in the Guadarrama Mountains. Most of the novel concerns Jordan's relations with the varied personalities of the band, including the girl Maria, with whom he falls in love. Through dialogue, flashbacks, and stories, Hemingway offers telling and vivid profiles of the Spanish character and unsparingly depicts the cruelty and inhumanity stirred up by the Civil War. Jordan's mission is to blow up a strategic bridge near Segovia in order to aid a coming Republican attack, which he realizes is doomed to fail. In an atmosphere of impending disaster, he blows up the bridge but is wounded and makes his retreating comrades leave him behind, where he prepares a last-minute resistance to his nationalist pursuers. All of his life Hemingway was fascinated by war. In A Farewell to Arms he focused on its pointlessness, in For Whom the Bell Tolls on the comradeship it creates, and, as World War II progressed, he made his way to London as a journalist. He flew several missions with the Royal Air Force and crossed the English Channel with American troops on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Attaching himself to the 22nd Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division, he saw a good deal of action in Normandy and in the Battle of the Bulge. He also participated in the liberation of Paris, and, although ostensibly a journalist, he impressed professional soldiers not only as a man of courage in battle but also as a real expert in military matters, guerrilla activities, and intelligence collection. Following the war in Europe, Hemingway returned to his home in Cuba and began to work seriously again. He also traveled widely, and, on a trip to Africa, he was injured in a plane crash. Soon after, in 1953, he received the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction for The Old Man and the Sea, 1952, a short heroic novel about an old Cuban fisherman who, after an extended struggle, hooks and boats a giant marlin only to have it eaten by voracious sharks during the long voyage home. This book, which played a role in gaining for Hemingway the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954, was as enthusiastically praised as his previous novel, Across the River and Into the Trees, 1950, the story of a professional army officer who dies while on leave in Venice, had been damned. By 1960 Hemingway had left Cuba and settled in Ketchum, Idaho. He expressed his belief in what he called the historical necessity of the Cuban Revolution. His attitude toward its leader, Fidel Castro, who had taken power in 1959, varied. He tried to lead his life and do his work as before. For a while he succeeded, but, anxiety-ridden and depressed, he was twice hospitalized at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, where he received electroshock treatments. 2 days after his return to the house in Ketchum, he took his life with a shotgun. Hemingway had been married 4 times, to Hadley Richardson in 1921, divorced 1927, Pauline Pfeiffer in 1927, divorced 1940, Martha Gellhorn in 1940, divorced 1945, and Mary Welsh in 1946. He had fathered 3 sons, John Hadley Nicanor, Bumby, with Hadley, born in 1923, Patrick, with Pauline, in 1928, and Gregory, also with Pauline, in 1931. Hemingway left behind a substantial amount of manuscript, some of which has been published. A Movable Feast, an entertaining memoir of his years in Paris, 1921-26, before he was famous, was issued in 1964. Islands in the Stream, 3 closely related novellas growing directly out of his peacetime memories of the Caribbean island of Bimini, of Havana during World War II, and of searching for U-boats off Cuba, appeared in 1970. Hemingway's characters plainly embody his own values and view of life. The main characters of The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, and For Whom the Bell Tolls are young men whose strength and self-confidence nevertheless coexist with a sensitivity that leaves them deeply scarred by their wartime experiences. War was for Hemingway a potent symbol of the world, which he viewed as complex, filled with moral ambiguities, and offering almost unavoidable pain, hurt, and destruction. To survive in such a world, and perhaps emerge victorious, one must conduct oneself with honor, courage, endurance, and dignity, a set of principles known as the Hemingway Code. To behave well in the lonely, losing battle with life is to show grace under pressure and constitutes in itself a kind of victory, a theme clearly established in The Old Man and the Sea. Hemingway's prose style was probably the most widely imitated of any in the 20th century. He wished to strip his own use of language of inessentials, ridding it of all traces of verbosity, embellishment, and sentimentality. In striving to be as objective and honest as possible, Hemingway hit upon the device of describing a series of actions by using short, simple sentences from which all comment or emotional rhetoric has been eliminated. These sentences are composed largely of nouns and verbs, have few adjectives and adverbs, and rely on repetition and rhythm for much of their effect. The resulting terse, concentrated prose is concrete and unemotional, yet is often resonant and capable of conveying great irony through understatement. Hemingway's use of dialogue was similarly fresh, simple, and natural sounding. The influence of this style was felt worldwide wherever novels were written, particularly from the 1930s through the 50s. A consummately contradictory man, Hemingway achieved a fame surpassed by few, if any, American authors of the 20th century. The virile nature of his writing, which attempted to recreate the exact physical sensations he experienced in wartime, big game hunting, and bullfighting, in fact masked an aesthetic sensibility of great delicacy. He was a celebrity long before he reached middle age, but his popularity continues to be validated by serious critical opinion.